A new rose on the desk. The early spring sunlight filtered through the sleek glass windows of Braven and Wells, casting crisp geometric shadows on the cubicle walls. Amy Sullivan paused near the elevator, clutching a paper cup of black coffee so tightly that the cardboard sleeve dented. She'd barely slept the night before, tossing and turning with a concoction of anticipation, anxiety, and the lingering echo of her father's phone call. "You'll be fine, Amy. Just show them who you are." Now, as the doors slid open and the scent of printer toner hit her, Amy squared her shoulders and stepped into her new chapter. The 23rd floor hummed with an early buzzing energy, a blend of muted laughter, thudding keystrokes, and the occasional ring of a landline. The office was open plan, but only in theory. A grid of modular desks, separated not just by thin partitions but by the silent politics that ran deep as the hidden network cables. Amy's desk had been readied for her, a slight, deliberate touch of welcome. A single scarlet rose in a square glass vase, droplets of water beading along the stem. An anonymous gesture, or so it seemed. She set her coffee down and traced a fingertip across the flower's velvet petal. The last time she'd received flowers at work, it had been a congratulatory bouquet when she closed her first major client. That felt like a long time ago. "Amy, right?" A sharply dressed woman appeared at her side, blonde bob immaculate, nails glossy pink. "Welcome to the jungle. I'm Melissa." Amy summoned a polite smile. "Thank you. It's kind of surreal, honestly." Melissa grinned, eyes flicking to the rose with a knowing little tilt. "Oh, you'll get used to it. Around here, the only thing that matters is results." She stepped back, her heel clicking against the tile just as two more women approached, trailing the scent of Chanel and curated confidence. "New blood!" The second woman, taller, curly hair bouncing, offered her hand. "I'm Tara. If you need anything, recommendations for lunch, which printer to avoid, who's secretly taking all the staplers, just ask me." The third, a sharp-boned brunette named Chloe, smiled with, "Harvard, huh? We'll see." By noon, Amy had mapped the social geography of her surroundings. There was an unspoken hierarchy. Melissa's desk closest to the window, Tara at the heart of every lunchtime huddle, Chloe always first to intercept the boss. Amid the morning flurry, Amy's desk remained an island, adorned with that singular, ambiguous rose. As the day wore on, she caught her own reflection in the monitor, a hint of tiredness beneath her careful eye makeup, determination flickering behind the wariness. She pressed her fingertips to the cool surface of the desk, grounding herself. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow the petals might begin to fall, or they might open wider. For now, all Amy could do was survive her first day, and remember that here, in the world of Braven and Wells, every rose had its thorns. Shadows at her back. By Wednesday, Amy's newness had worn off. Her carefully chosen blazers felt stiffer. The smile she carried from home faded at the office door and re-emerged only when she passed a mirror on her way to the restroom. Overhead, the HVAC hummed ceaselessly, adding to the machine-like rhythm of her days. Yet she couldn't put her finger on exactly when the whispering started. Maybe it had always been there, hidden behind polite grins and, "Let me show you how we do things here." Maybe it started as soon as she'd shaken Melissa's hand. It was subtle at first. A cluster of coworkers would hush when Amy walked by, only to resume talking as she left with a laugh that never reached her ears. Inside the break room, her mug went missing. At a morning meeting, the division manager referenced a report she was supposed to send, but the file had vanished from the shared drive. "Check your permissions," Chloe advised, her dark eyes twinkling. "It happens to all of us." but Amy could hear the skepticism beneath the politeness. That Thursday afternoon, as Amy tapped out emails, a message pinged in her inbox, a thread she hadn't been CC'd on before. The conversation was about her. "We need someone reliable on this. Harvard doesn't mean she knows our clients. She came away feeling more invisible, awash in the sense that everyone was moving to a beat she couldn't hear. By the end of the week, a pattern emerged. Amy would pass by Tara's desk and see the three women huddled together, heads bowed over a phone, snickering. An email would ping, "Missed a typo, Amy." A Slack message, "Melissa wants her client file back ASAP." She was being tested. That Friday, as she packed up, she found a sticky note left on her keyboard in looping handwriting. "Heads up, some people don't like competition. Keep smiling." No signature. She studied the words, trying to decipher the tone. Was it warning? Threat? Solidarity? Amy slid her laptop into her bag, spine rigid, the note crackling between her fingers. As she passed the elevator, she saw Chloe's eyes follow her, a glimmer of challenge behind the careful mask. The office felt colder than ever, an undercurrent of rivalry and rumors swirling just beneath the fluorescent lights. Amy took a deep breath, counting to 3. She would not let them see her sweat. But as she drove home in the pale March twilight, eastern seaboard sky smudged gold and blue, one thought echoed in Amy's mind. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was most certainly on the outside. The first strike. The storm rolled in on a Monday, gray clouds thickening above the city, wind shaking the high-rise windows as if the world itself bristled in anticipation. Amy woke early, nerves jangling in her stomach. Something in the air made her uneasy, a sense of crossing some invisible line. She shrugged off the feeling and dressed with deliberate precision. Navy wrap dress, hair pulled back in a clean twist, her lips in a steel-hued smile. At 8:57, Amy's inbox chimed with a calendar invite. Quarterly performance meeting, mandatory. The subject line was signed by Melissa, bolded in all caps. Odd, Amy thought, that her first performance review would arrive just 5 weeks in. In the glass-cold conference room, 3 chairs remained empty. Amy recognized the feeling from her college debate tournament. Any of these. Amy pushed out, her voice shaky before she caught herself. My messages were cleared by compliance. There must be a mistake. Tara shrugged in mock sympathy. It happens. Sometimes new hires don't understand all the protocols. There's also the Monroe call, Melissa cut in, clicking to her laptop. Speakers crackled with tinny audio, Amy's voice stumbling mid-presentation, Monroe's impatience plain as day. Amy's chest tightened. That call had been rough, but no one had warned her about the client's impossible expectations. Now, isolated from the context, her missteps sounded like incompetence. The verdict came swiftly. We're taking you off the Gibson account for now, Melissa announced. Effective immediately. And please refrain from attending leadership meetings until further notice. We want you to focus on policies. Get better acquainted with the process. Her words were smooth as velvet, cutting as glass. Amy barely registered the rest of the meeting. Each voice was a distant drumbeat. By the time she made it back to her desk, the rumors had beaten her there. Colleagues glancing up, confusion laced with thinly veiled satisfaction. Her name was already drifting in the current, attached to words like unreliable and not ready. Her calendar filled with remedial training sessions. Files vanished from her shared folder. The rose was gone from her desk, disposed of, no doubt, by the same invisible hands that had offered it. Amy locked herself in the bathroom, bracing her palms against the cold porcelain of the sink. She stared at her reflection, at the ghost of confidence in her eyes, and held back tears of fury and humiliation. That night, as rain battered the city and thunder rattled her apartment window, Amy sat in the dark, replaying every word, every look, every unanswered email. If this was a warning, she understood it loud and clear. She was alone, and the rules of the game had just changed. Amy spent the following weekend in a fog. She ignored the vibrating phone, let email notifications pile up, and wandered her apartment in mumbled. But even as she spoke, she knew Maya was right. She'd fought harder than this before, and for less. You know what separates you from women like them. You have a conscience and a backbone. Just don't let them see you bleed. That night, long after Maya left, Amy stood before her bathroom mirror and studied her own tired eyes, red-rimmed but fierce beneath the exhaustion. She made a vow to herself in that quiet darkness. If they were going to play dirty, she would learn how to play smarter. On Monday, Amy arrived at the office half an hour early, stripped of the uncertain politeness she'd worn like armor. Her hair was straight, her suit jacket just a touch bolder in color, her walk less apologetic. She found her desk redressed, freshly wiped, the ghostly smudge where the rose vase had stood just visible in the morning light. She spent her first hour cataloging the details she'd ignored her first weeks, who arrived early and who always slipped in late, how Melissa's eyes darted to her phone during every meeting, the nervous way Tara triple-checked her calendar invites. By noon, Amy started keeping a notebook, not just for tasks, but for whispered conversations, office political quirks, timing of suspiciously delayed emails. She said less in meetings, listened more. At lunch, when Chloe forgot to invite her again, Amy feigned indifference and sat with Brian from IT, chatting about system logins. She learned that Melissa had a standing lunch out every Thursday with a partner from HR. Tara was nursing resentments about an account she'd lost last year. Chloe took mysterious personal calls at exactly the same time every Tuesday and Friday. The anger inside Amy cooled to something razor-sharp. She watched the others jealously guard their secrets, their alliances brittle and easily threatened. Hidden among the debris of jealousy and ambition, she glimpsed fault lines, opportunities waiting. But her transformation wasn't just in her attitude. Amy made subtle changes to her look, brighter lipstick, simpler jewelry. She practiced her game face in the mirror until it became seamless, composed, unreadable, a blank page on which no malice could write itself. That Thursday, when the manager's deep for secrets. Amy's transformation attracted little comment but plenty of watchful eyes. By her third week in exile, she blended seamlessly into the background. The watchful and the arrogant rarely notice the quiet ones. In that hush, Amy began her work in earnest, sifting through the subtle and not-so-subtle messes others left behind. She spun her isolation into camouflage. Unable to reclaim lost projects, she instead mastered internal systems, learning which inboxes were neglected, where old reports lay gathering dust. She struck up reluctant friendships with people on the periphery, office admins, mailroom staff, and the ever-helpful tech guy, Brian. A lunchtime chat here, a shared conference call there, and the invisible machinery humming beneath Braven and Wells slowly revealed itself. It amazed her how much the world of cubicle life ran on routine and habit. Tara swore by her daily vanilla chai, always from the corner cafe, always picked up at 2:15 p.m. Melissa was scrupulously neat, except for a bottom desk drawer that occasionally jabbed shut on a spilled receipt or unopened memo. Chloe could be found every other Friday in a windowless phone booth on the 15th floor, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and urgent. At first, Amy's efforts netted trivial observations. Someone faking sick days to extend a weekend, another palming company pens into a purse. But by week's end, deeper fissures appeared. She overheard Tara snapping at an intern about a client file that was accidentally deleted after a heated argument and then replaced overnight with a vaguely edited copy. Melissa, always trim and precise, seemed to be fielding calls from suppliers that never made it onto any invoice Amy could find. Brian, who liked Amy's dry jokes and never liked Melissa's demands, muttered about a suspicious IT ticket, someone repeatedly requesting access to upper management folders late at night. With every new piece, Amy's notebook filled up, not just facts, but fragments, context, and timelines. She made a game of cross-referencing rumor with reality. Most of Braven and Wells reveled in the drama, petty betrayals, who wanted what from whom, and Amy realized how loyalty, when weaponized, could be transformed into a fault-line. The window was steady, eyes glittering with the sharpness that only comes from pain repurposed as purpose. She took a last sip of cold coffee and smiled to herself, faint but sure. She wasn't just playing defense anymore. The seeds of counterstrike, subtle, cold, and precise, were quietly taking root. The spark ignites. After weeks in the shadows, Amy finally saw her moment. It happened late on a Thursday, one of those days when Manhattan's sky was choked with fog, blurring the gleaming skyline into a somber smear. The office emptied early for Melissa's team building. Cocktail hour at an uptown rooftop bar. Amy, conveniently swamped with report deadlines, slipped her RSVP into the polite decline pile and watched the last of her colleagues bustle out amid nervous laughter and designer boots. The silence left behind was thick and still, rippling only with the low hum of ventilation and distant city traffic. Amy's fingers shook a little as she unlocked her computer and stared at the flurry of spreadsheets on her monitor. But tonight was not for catching up on work. She made her way quietly down the hall to the copy room. This was where Brian had once complained the wireless lagged just enough to log the night owls and late access requests. With slow, measured steps, Amy pulled her own laptop from her bag and plugged into the company Ethernet. She'd learned, by quiet persistence, the difference between innocent mistake and deliberate omission, how metadata trailed changes, how the audit logs quietly tallied who accessed which files when. Tonight, she let herself follow the trail. In Melissa's folder, Amy found what she suspected: a series of heavily revised client payment records, numbers that shimmered with precision but didn't quite match the originals tucked in a backup folder. In Tara's folder, a list of rewritten client contact logs, corrections, completed at odd hours and often with Chloe CC'd in the early morning hours. She took screenshots where she could, laid digital breadcrumbs too subtle to be traced, and tucked her findings into an encrypted drive only she could access. She wasn't gunning for blackmail, just a lifeline. But it felt powerful, intoxicating, to stare down the paper tigers of her undoing. Cooled to something razor-sharp. The trap had been deliberate, but it could also be unraveled. With cold determination, Amy gathered every record, every edit log, every fragment she needed. By the time midnight rolled around and the city had slipped into the hush between trains, Amy was finished. Her evidence organized, her strategy clear. It was no longer just about survival. The board was set, the pieces moving. She switched off her laptop and stared out into the fog, a swell of courage surging quietly within her. Tomorrow would not be the same as yesterday. The spark had ignited, and Amy was ready to see it burn. First moves. Friday morning dawned bright and crisp, sunlight breaking through the clouds in sudden golden shafts. Amy barely noticed the change in weather. Everything within her felt tightened, taut as a wire. She dressed with care. Simple emerald blouse, tailored black slacks, a silver barrette in her hair. A look that declared quiet confidence. For the first time since joining Braven and Wells, she almost felt like herself. When she stepped into the elevator, the faces around her were familiar, yet kept a calculated distance. Some glanced up, then away. She smiled and nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, already strategizing. She had no illusions about the risks ahead. If she played her hand too openly, she could lose everything. But if she stayed silent, she'd be boxed in forever. By 10, the office was buzzing. Melissa swept through the halls in a tailored navy dress, her voice brisk with fabricated warmth. Chloe and Tara clustered by the window, cupping coffee and laughing in clipped, controlled bursts. Amy barely looked at them. She went straight to Brian's cubicle. Brian was poking at his keyboard, headphones slung around his neck. When Amy appeared, he grinned, half surprise, half relief. "Hey, Amy, what's up?" "I'm hoping you might help me with something. I'm trying to make sense of the shared drive permissions, especially the edits to client records." He straightened, suddenly alert. There was a history between. Amy made her first move. She drafted an anonymous tip attaching only the most irrefutable evidence and sent it to the company's compliance division. She even cited IT irregularities, using phrases she knew would flag an internal review. No names, no accusations, just data. She also began subtly shifting her presence in the office. Amy made deliberate choices. Sitting near senior managers during lunch, offering small, insightful comments in meetings, always paired with facts. She didn't bring up the Monroe call, but included just enough in her memos to show she had nothing to hide. By Monday, the air in the office felt electric. Tara was nervous, her laughter brittle. Melissa left for meetings with her lips pressed into a hard white line. Chloe was quieter, watching Amy with the coolness of someone who'd suddenly lost a crucial advantage. Late that afternoon, an unexpected email dropped into Amy's inbox. Compliance audit, request for input. All employees, especially those attached to the Gibson and Monroe accounts, would be interviewed. Amy felt her pulse leap. The moves had been set in motion. As she left the building that night, city lights flickered across her windshield. She allowed a tiny private smile. The battle was nowhere near over, but for the first time, Amy had shaped the game, and the next move, she told herself, would be entirely hers. Under the microscope. The following days arrived tense and finely drawn, like a violin string stretched to the edge of its breaking point. Word of the compliance audit tore through the Braven and Wells office with the force of a thunderclap. Overnight, the friendly hum of conversation soured into nervous whispers, and the scent of anxiety hung thick in every hallway. Amy watched as the office's rhythm changed. Colleagues who once breezed by her with detached indifference now seemed to linger, casting darting looks at her face as if hoping to read some clandestine clue. Tara and Chloe, usually inseparable, walked the halls in stiff silence, each protecting their own secrets. Melissa retreated into her office, blinds drawn and door locked, phone calls hushed to a barely and project communications. Amy nodded. She gave her answers clearly, never defensive, never volunteering more than the facts required. When asked about edits and after-hours changes to the Gibson and Monroe accounts, she referenced documented procedures, noting which communications she'd saved, which permissions she'd requested. She remained steadfast when they pressed about the Monroe call, offering her original timeline and expressing willingness to clarify gaps. She did not implicate others directly, but she didn't obscure the truth either. Her answers marked out a boundary, honest but not naive, transparent but not reckless. After 20 minutes, the auditors dismissed her. Amy swept up her notes, hands trembling slightly as she closed the conference room door behind her. She made her way back to her desk under the gaze of a dozen curious eyes. From that day forward, the office was a hive of suppressed turmoil. The auditor's presence tightened the air. Interviews continued behind closed doors. Laptops were checked, policies scrutinized. Brian kept his head down but found a minute to pass her a scribbled note. Heard you handled it like a pro. Good luck. By Thursday, rumors ran hot. Melissa had been called in twice. Chloe left early, eyes rimmed with red. Tara's laughter was gone. She sat at her desk, typing with rigid mechanical precision. The power dynamics Amy had once feared were fracturing. Old alliances weakened by self-preservation. Nobody knew who might be the next to fall. For the first time in weeks, Amy felt something other than fear or anger. It was a cautious flicker of hope, small and steady, as if she'd finally come up for air after weeks underwater. That night, as she shut down her computer and stood to leave, Amy spotted her reflection in the lobby's glass door. She paused, searching that image for signs of weakness. Instead, she saw someone unbroken, holding the line. She turned out into the glittering city, the knowledge settling in her bones. For now, she had survived the fire, and maybe, just maybe, she was forging something stronger from the flames. Fault lines exposed. Inboxes across the floor. Amy watched from her desk as Melissa, usually immaculate, emerged, pale-faced with a shell-shock cast to her eyes. Her heels clicked frantically as she stalked past, barely acknowledging anyone. By midday, gossip outpaced the facts. It wasn't just Melissa. Chloe and Tara had also been called in for second interviews, their voices tremulous, hands trembling as they fielded calls behind closed doors. It was clear to everyone now. The audit was no routine procedure. It was a rupture, exposing every hidden grievance and betrayal. As the office reeled, Amy focused inward. She reminded herself of the meticulous record she'd kept, the restraint she'd shown in her interview. For so long, she'd walked on eggshells, doubting each new step. Now she saw the value of her caution, her avoidance of the backroom deals and whispered alliances so many others relied on. The final blow arrived Friday morning, without warning. Human Resources, accompanied by the auditors, entered with the kind of formality reserved for catastrophe. Senior staff were called one by one, behind closed doors, each summoned with a grim, clipped message. Amy waited, listening to the measured footsteps, the opening and closing of the HR door, the whispered condolences as faces turned pale. By lunchtime, word had spread. Melissa had been placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. Chloe and Tara were under review. More than one mid-level manager was seen quietly packing away personal items. Through it all, Amy was not called in again. She sat at her desk, the hum of the office growing stranger, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. People she'd barely spoken to before now glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with wary respect. It was as if she were standing in the eye of a storm, untouched, but surrounded by a swirl of consequences. That afternoon, Maya called. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice urgent. "I think so," Amy replied, her words steady. "It's complicated." Maya was silent for a beat,
"You survived it, Amy. Maybe that's enough for now." Amy nodded, feeling the fatigue of months settle along her shoulders. She stared out at the Manhattan skyline, the city pulsing on beyond the glass. Her world had been upended, but she was still standing.
Rhythms or alliances. Amy noticed the changes immediately. Desks that had once been bustling with activity now lay eerily quiet, their previous occupants gone, their chairs pushed in with a finality that rang louder than any words. The coffee lounge, usually awash with voices, fell to uneasy silence whenever someone new entered. Gone were the old jokes, the careful games of office loyalty. In their place was a sense of chastened openness. Colleagues now greeted each other with genuine uncertainty, as if recalibrating what trust was supposed to look like. It would have been easy to drift along the margins again, to retreat into self-preservation. Yet Amy found herself doing the opposite. Something inside her, steady, battered but unbroken, steered her toward the center of things. The battles had left her scarred, but also sharpened. She paid closer attention to the junior analyst nervously proposing a new approach at the Monday meeting, to the older receptionist who, for the first time, shared a quiet laugh with Amy over an office printer jam. The invisible walls were down, and connection, real connection, felt possible. Invitations trickled in. A project team reached out, asking for her perspective. The compliance division organized a roundtable, curious about gaps in training and procedures. HR even asked if she'd mentor a few new hires. At first, Amy accepted cautiously, wary of old patterns repeating. But as the days became weeks, she realized the change was real, not just in the company, but in herself. With every meeting, every single moment she dared to speak up, Amy's voice grew steadier. Where she'd once feared retaliation, she now embraced the power of transparency. Data she'd once hoarded as a shield, she shared freely to teach others. She didn't forget what had happened. She remembered every slight, every lost opportunity, every sting of humiliation. But she let it coexist alongside new growth. The past had turned from a trap into a foundation. One gray Friday evening, Amy lingered in the empty lobby, a new report clutched in her hand. She looked at her reflection. Scandal and audit, she discovered a steadiness she hadn't believed possible, a low, persistent flame replacing the anxious pulse she'd carried for so long. 2 weeks after the final compliance report circulated, Amy received an unexpected email. Quarterly Strategy Luncheon, Executive Invite. Her name, alphabetically tucked between department heads and senior partners, looked surreal on the list. She read it 3 times before the impact registered. The luncheon itself was held in a private suite above Bryant Park, a minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows and crisp white linens. Around the long mahogany table, the faces were sharp with ambition and polished by experience. This was a room where decisions were made and futures shaped. Amy smoothed a stray strand of hair, feigning calm. Brian caught her eye from his far corner seat, giving a reassuring nod. She clung to that brief glance, grounding herself. The CEO started the meeting with measured candor. "We must acknowledge recent challenges and thank those who embodied integrity and transparency," he said, his gaze briefly resting on Amy. "Our future relies not on perfection, but courage and accountability." Others spoke about growth targets, client retention, new technologies, cultural reform. Amy listened, absorbing the cadence of high-level debate, the subtle shifts in power. When her turn came, unexpectedly early in the agenda, her chest fluttered with nerves. She shared her thoughts on gaps in compliance, proposing a peer-led mentorship program that bridged senior and junior talent. Her words left her mouth steadier than she felt. The suggestions were practical, but she also risked something tender. If we want trust, we have to model it. It can't be something we just talk about after mistakes. It needs to be part of how we build every day. She braced for dismissal, or at best, polite nods. But to her surprise, the room went quiet before senior partner Ms. Lindstrom leaned forward. "That's the first actionable idea I've heard today," she said. "Let's put real resources behind it." Others murmured agreement. For a moment, Amy allowed herself to believe rougher days when the urge to retreat pulled strong. But with every small victory, she claimed a little more space at the table. That evening, she walked the busy avenue with a mind full of plans, some small, others bold. Whatever came next, she knew she was done shrinking herself to fit old roles. She belonged, not because the world had given her permission, but because she had earned her place. And at last, she intended to keep it. Bridges and boundaries. Autumn deepened, painting the city in hues of copper and gold. Change fluttered everywhere, leaves swirling at Amy's feet, sunlight glittering off skyscraper glass, a gentle urgency in the chilled air. Inside Braven and Wells, subtle currents of renewal ran beneath the steady routine, reshaping the culture in small, significant ways. Amy's proposal for the mentorship program had taken root surprisingly fast. HR brought her in to help design its structure, pairing new hires with seasoned staffers. She watched her once shy ideas gain traction, seeing faces light up in meetings that used to feel like battlegrounds. Each day, Amy committed herself not only to her work, but to rebuilding the trust that had nearly been lost. One afternoon, she lingered after a group session, gathering loose notes, when Chloe approached. Once, the sight of Chloe's crisp suits and disarming smile would have sharpened Amy's anxiety. Now, she met her with cautious composure. "May I?" Chloe asked, sweeping her hair behind her ear. "Of course," Amy replied, her voice even. She braced for defensiveness or veiled accusations. Instead, Chloe hesitated. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Her eyes flickered, uncertain. "We all got swept up in things we shouldn't have. It wasn't fair to you." Amy considered her words. She sensed the effort it took for Chloe to admit fault. "Thank you," she said gently. "It's been a learning curve for everyone. I think we're all trying to do better now." They stood in quiet, a fragile bridge spanning old grievances. Neither pretended the past hadn't happened, but in that moment, something shifted. A boundary began to heal. Later that week, Amy found herself back into silence. But each time doubt crept in, Amy remembered the feeling of finding her own footing, the quiet gladness of offering others the hand she'd once longed for. Her boundaries, though firmer, did not close her off. When Brian suggested Friday lunches for the mentorship group, Amy agreed, even organizing the first outing. She laughed with her colleagues, enjoyed the easy warmth of shared stories, the hesitant jokes that became genuine smiles. Through these small gestures, she felt the office rebuilding itself, not in sweeping declarations, but in the gentle persistence of everyday kindness. As the city darkened early each evening and lights winked on in distant windows, Amy walked home through neighborhoods dappled amber and umber, content with the knowledge that bridges could be built without erasing the boundaries that made her strong. Change moved slow, sometimes heartbreakingly so. But with each new connection, the world felt a little less unkind. From her high-rise window, Amy looked at the city burning bright against the autumn sky. 1,000 stories unfolding, some ending and some just beginning. For her part, she had learned to keep faith in both the bridges she built and the boundaries she honored.